Good morning and welcome to Community Conversations. I'm Vicki Green. Today in studio with me is someone with an amazing story, someone who calls himself a person in long-term recovery from years of substance abuse. He was recently elected to his 7th term in the 14th Worcester District at the State House from West Boylston. I welcome State Representative Jim O'Day.
Good morning, Vicki. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely, because I think your story about recovery and the opioid epidemic garners immediate respect and lends validity to all the work that you've been doing on this epidemic. So before we get into numbers, which most listening know is a very high number of people struggling with this, can you tell us a bit about your story and your road to recovery?
Sure. So I've been a person in long-term recovery now for over 21 years. And I have to say that being in recovery has given me an opportunity to do things that I never, ever thought was possible. And so I think that part of why I was happy to come on your show today is to maybe be able to have somebody hear a little piece of my story and that they might be able to identify with some of the issues that, I think people in recovery or those who are active addicts can identify with. Early on, it all started out as fun and games. And at some point in time, the fun and games became a full-time job. You were in
7th grade when you had your first drink, is that right?
Yeah, and it could have been a little...
In Worcester?
Yeah, I'm from Worcester. And I actually ran into the kid I was with, I believe, that day, who has lived out in California for the last 25 or 30 years. And we just had this a reunion for West Boylston Street School, which was an old grammar school in the city of Worcester. And he doesn't drink anymore either, so it's probably a good thing. But
your family, I read in this article, that your family had a bar that you worked at.
Right.
And then you started your own bar
at
23 years old?
Yeah, probably too young to have a bar.
So it started with drinking.
Yep.
And then what happened?
Then other things came into play. If you think about what the time frame was, we're talking the late 70s, the early 80s. You can imagine some of the things that were going on in those days. And, owning a bar for a guy who liked to have fun and liked to drink.
And was 23.
You don't always do the right thing when you're 23. So I guess one of my messages would be, if you're 23 and you like to drink, you're probably not a great idea to go and open up a bar. But, my father was a Worcester police officer.
Oh.
So, I also knew that...
And he owned a bar?
He was retired by the time they
okay.
bought the bar. And I knew that, I needed to kind of keep my nose clean, sort of. It was really crazy, sort of a crazy dynamic when you think about it. My grandfather was a police officer. I had an uncle that was a police officer, so I was always sort of on that line of on which side of the law was I going to be on.
And what happened from the drinking? That led to...
So, drinking led to other substances, and then in the very end, there was a horrible substance that I was involved with, and it just took over every thought that I had.
And it affected every area
of your life. So I was a social worker. Once I left that bar business, I did.
But you were still an addict and working as a social worker.
Well, I was, yeah. So in the end, I was definitely an addict working as a social worker, and that was a horrible place to be. Okay. Trying to help families that are struggling and, myself struggling. So, not being able to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning is not a pleasant thing to deal with. So, I relapsed. My first go into
what made you go in the first place?
I was sick and tired of being on the treadmill. Every day sort of turned into Groundhog's Day, right? It was the same routine, and in order to kind of get going on the day, certain things had to take place, and so I would feel better. And so looking at yourself in the mirror, knowing that wasn't what I really had dreamed to do, to become an addict, and knowing that I was disappointing a whole lot of people, including myself, I went to my first detox in 1991, and I didn't ultimately get clean until 1997.
But you kept going back.
Kept going back, heard some things that made sense to me. Was very fortunate to get involved with some really, really good guys in recovery who just kept saying to me, just keep coming and don't use, and things will get better. And, early on I didn't believe that, but as little by slow, as things progressed, things did get better. I managed to get some time under my belt, and lo and behold, here we are 21 years later, and I much prefer to talk about the life I have now than that miserable, ugly, horrible life that I had when I was really in the throes of addiction.
So now look where you are. I mean, you're a state representative. You went from being a recovering addict to being a state representative. You just were reelected for your 7th term. So it's all really turned around. And it seems like you can obviously use your experience to help others. And you are. You're on the Worcester District Attorney Joe Early's opioid task force. You've been very involved at the state level. So you are also on the board of United Way. And at the State House, you're chair of the Joint Committee on Municipalities and Regional Government. And I read all about your involvement with homeless youth. And as a social worker, I think you're just a very passionate and empathetic person in general. So let's explain to people that may be listening that may not know, what are considered opioids?
So it's certainly a class of drug that will, so there's, I can name off a few that people may be aware of, Percodins, Percocets, OxyContin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, opium, of course, heroin.
What about Tylenol with codeine?
Codeine, yes, indeed, absolutely. Cough syrup with codeine in it. Those are all opioid derivatives. And so those are, most of what I just mentioned, with the exception of heroin and opium, are all prescription medications. So the average person being prescribed a particular pain medication by their dentist, their doctor, their orthopedist, whomever it might be, would not necessarily. I think today we're in a better place, obviously, because of this crisis that we're facing, that people are becoming more aware of sort of the very negative side effects if you don't use these medications as prescribed, right? But unfortunately, the horse is a little bit out of the barn, right? When OxyContin first came onto the market, it was billed as a non-addictive pain medication.
Sounds like cigarettes to me.
Yeah, sounds a little bit like it, right? So, doctors were prescribing those pretty liberally, and in a very short time after that crisis, that epidemic that we're in, exploded. And so it's become an incredible focus for not just Massachusetts, but for every state, right, and for our national government, for us to really have to be spending, gads of money on how do we get ourselves out of this mess, and try to get people much better educated on, what am I getting here? What is it that this doctor's prescribing to me? What do I need to know?
Right, because sometimes people are afraid to ask doctors. They think the doctor is the end-all, be-all. If they're telling me to take this, I got to take it, and they don't ask questions about it.
We have to be our own best advocates, right? Unfortunately, though, if you're 75 or 77 or 80, you may not be as sharp as you were when you were 33, right, or 25. And if you're 16 or 17 or 18 and you're a young kid and you're playing football for your high school team and you tore your ACL, and, to deal with that initial, incredible pain, doctor prescribed you 30 OxyContin, and you really only needed to take 12, but you ended up taking 18 and then 20 and then 25, and then you were like calling the doctor every other week saying I'm still in unbelievable pain and I need more medication.
Well, I think that then leads us into what Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito started in 2016 with the first legislation known as the CARE Act, C-A-R-E. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that involves? And that does involve actual education of doctors, of med students, of dentists. You forget that dentists prescribe. I've had dentists give me because I needed them. I'm not addicted and I needed it. Psychiatrists, et cetera. So what did that bill, the first part of the CARE Act, do about prescription?
Yeah, so that was one of the main pieces of that initial bill was the prescription monitoring part of it, so that, e-records, right? Everything's electronically, and we're trying to manage as we sort of look at what's being, prescribed. Addicts, I can tell you, are very good at conning doctors, at doctor shopping. So in order to sort of follow that kind of behavior with the prescription monitoring, it makes it a lot, I'm not going to say easy or easier, but it gives us an opportunity to try to keep a better eye on who's prescribing all these medications, who's receiving all these medications, what are they being used for, so on and so forth. So that has been a big piece of CARE Act 1. I think another important piece of that act as well has something to do with very much right here in central Massachusetts. Medical schools, if 10 years ago, it was probably about 5 minutes spent on, addiction within that medical school teaching. Now here, between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts legislature and Mass Medical School, Governor Baker was able to come up with a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that our medical school, our state owned and facilitated medical school, actually spends some significant time now with our medical students talking about addiction, talking about pain, and talking about pain management, and maybe some other options towards pain management, which was sort of addressed in the most recent CARE Act, CARE 2.
Which was 2 months ago, which you were involved in.
That's right.
But in the first one, didn't they limit the number of days that you can be prescribed back in 2016?
Yeah, I think it was 30. I can't remember.
Yeah, it was a certain number of days. They limited the number of days that a doctor could prescribe.
Correct.
And they made the doctors more aware, because we hear of doctor shopping, where people are addicted and they'll just call another doctor to write them a prescription.
Right.
But now those doctors are being held accountable.
Right, because we can now monitor that. Right, we couldn't do that before.
Right.
Well, not as easily as we can now.
So when we talk about demographics, the Department of Public Health and other state sources have said that the majority of opioid-related deaths, not the majority, about 55-60% are white men. The average age between 30 and 40, that's average. So, of course, you see a lot of people that start maybe 18, 20, 21. They don't get help, so they're not recorded as having it. But we saw approximately 80 deaths in the city of Worcester in 2017, opioid-related. And the data shows a big increase in opioid-related deaths in Worcester proper from 2013 to 2015. And then we saw a drop in 2016. And 2017 was about 74 one year, 79 in 2017. So it stayed about the same. So do you think the CARE Act started, that's why we're seeing kind of it come down a bit from 2016?
Yeah, I think one of the important pieces that I left out of that conversation was the whole idea of, the reversal medication, a Narcan. So first responders back in 2015, we had some across the state that were using that, but not as many as that's increased certainly over the last 3 or 4 years. And here with CARE Act 2, we now within that legislation, anyone, any family member, anyone can go to a pharmacy. Someone who may have a family member that are using opioids, and they want to sort of have a little bit of a protection at the home or with them. You can go into a pharmacy today and ask for Narcan.
And that just happened a couple of months ago.
And that happened in the most recent CARE Act, too.
So there's no negative impact on Narcan? I mean, there's no reason that anybody could get harmed by that? I mean, by going to a pharmacy?
Unfortunately, this, first and foremost, I probably should have started it off by with this comment. This is a disease, right? Addiction is a disease. There is no question about that. I think 40 years ago, 30 years ago, there were still people trying to say this is a moral failing and a moral issue. This is, in fact, a disease. So, people will say that if we save someone, that we're only saving them for them to go back and use again. Well, I mean, I think that's insane, right?
Or we're taking steps so that doesn't happen anyway.
Right. So we're saving people's lives to hopefully give them the opportunity because, again, CARE Act 2 has made additional strides in talking about enhancing education, talking about enhancing treatment facilities, having better treatment, having more treatment, having more, counseling accessible to folks that need it.
They call them recovery coaches?
Well, that's another piece of the bill. Yeah, I mean, so that's a little bit of a new option.
Okay.
And I certainly strongly support that, and I was pretty active in the language that went into the bill and talking about recovery coaches. I think over the years we have found that folks who have had a history similar to mine and who are in long-term recovery, someone that's actively using not to diminish in any way a real clinician, right? But
well, you are one.
Well, I'm that as well. But there are those who are not in recovery who do not have an issue with drugs or alcohol, but are also certainly capable and very skilled at working with individuals who are working through their recovery issues, right? And so I think those aspects of the CARE Act are hugely important. We're looking to try to quantify and standardize sort of what does a recovery coach look like, right? So that they can be compensated via insurance, right? So right now, some folks are using recovery coaches, but they're not necessarily being compensated through your health care policy. So we're trying to figure out how do we sort of standardize that. Is there a supervisory sort of level of a recovery coach and then a recovery coach who is really just sort of doing that day-to-day working with someone in early recovery, trying to help them put one foot in front of the other and showing them, the right way to maintain their strong recovery.
So what do you think, that you were very involved too in the second part of the CARE Act, which was this year, 2018, which added several things to the original bill, as you had said. So what do you think was the most important part of that legislation? And I know you were involved with something called MAT, which is medically assisted treatment, which is a little bit controversial, or some people will disagree. And this involves people in prison.
Right. So there's actually sort of two pieces to the MAT part. So if you remember, one of the pieces of the bill that did not, one of the pieces of the original bill, the governor's bill, which did not come out of the final version after it went through conference committee, was the whole idea of holding folks for 72 hours if they were brought to an emergency room after an overdose.
Right, they are not allowed to be held.
That's right. So, but what we did do in that bill was put in language so that that same person who came in with the overdose, several hours after they've been Narcan, they come out of it and they're ready to go off. If they've asked for treatment, that's great. And we are working diligently to make sure that someone who's come in comes out of the ether, so to speak, right? And they say, hey, I want treatment. This bill is supposed to make it so that that person has a warm handoff to someone that we know they're going into treatment.
So we're not forcing them.
Not forcing them. It's really for those who say, I want treatment. If we have that person, we need to be able to provide that.
Now, what about people who are in prison and they're addicted? Now, the first part involved, I know, MCI Framingham for women. People were being arrested for substance abuse, and rather than getting help for mental health issues, for substance abuse issues, they were being sent to prison.
Right. And, and that's, so the MAT piece for prisons and houses of correction is a pilot program. And I will tell you that the main focus of this MAT for those individuals is that the overdose rate for folks coming out of a house of correction is 120% higher than the average person, the average addict. Okay,
120% greater that they're going to
that they're going to overdose. Right.
Wow. So
I was asked this question. So what is considered success when we're talking about people on MAT? Right?
Medically assisted.
Treatment. Yes, no, medically assisted treatment. And I really had to give that some thought, because you could have these long-winded explanations and answers to that question. I think initially, if we lower the rate of people that are dying when they come out of prison, that's success. Now, they may still be on medically assisted medication. And then, what's the next level of success? Can they become functioning members of society, even though they may still be receiving some level of medically assisted treatment, whether it's methadone or Suboxone or some combination of both? Are they able to go to work? Are they able to provide for their family? Are they able to, maintain their employment? Are they able to maintain a house, a roof over their head? I'd say that that's a level of success. Now, some people are very stringent on that. If you're not clean, you're not clean.
Right. It's like they're saying you're treating a medical issue with another another medicine.
So I think first and foremost, it's really designed to make sure we don't have people coming out of jail. They haven't used in several weeks or several months, and they're going through withdrawal. They weren't getting treatment in jail.
Yep.
Right. And the first thing they go out, they may go and take a substance that they were used to using before going in, but this time it's laced with fentanyl, or the potency has increased 10% or 20% since the last time they used that. Their risk of overdose is really, really high.
Now that brings up something. We know that in Massachusetts, east of the Mississippi, the first two recreational marijuana operations were allowed to begin selling. Do you think that that's going to have positive impact, negative impact, no impact?
On the opioid epidemic?
Yeah.
So for those that are in the throes of addiction with opioids, there are those who say that they get some relief that helps with their cravings from using their drug of choice or opioids. So it may have a little bit of a buffering effect for them. Then there's the whole issue around, is marijuana a gateway drug? I think most people would argue that it is. So, however, people oftentimes love to leave that whole, issue of alcohol out of any
that's a big one.
Out of any discussion, and that is certainly a gateway drug. Tobacco, as far as I'm concerned, is the number one gateway drug. That is probably 80 or 90% of our kids who first use some sort of a drug. It's probably nicotine.
Or nowadays, the Juul.
The Juul. Who knows what the hell's in that? I don't even know what's in that.
So anybody who's just joining us here, I have in studio here with me State Representative Jim O'Day from West Boylston and Worcester District, who is been in long-term recovery and is in his 7th term. So you were among, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but you were among 15 legislators that traveled to Portugal fairly recently to meet with the president of that country and others to talk about a variety of issues, but including their decriminalization of opioids, so it's not a crime, and how it's effective in their communities. What did you take away from that trip?
So, unfortunately, it's a very difficult comparison.
Okay.
It's a much smaller country. right? Their population is about the size of Massachusetts, maybe 1 million or so larger. It is, if you're a user of opioids there, and it's clearly sort of discernible that you're a user, right? You can pretty much identify this individual as someone that's using and not selling, right? Or not, possessing and pushing along large sums of opioids, that they do everything in their power to get you treatment, right? And they do everything in their power to keep you out of the criminal sort of path, right? And so they offer, clearly offer treatment on demand. They're there to really sort of guide that person who is, the user of that substance. But they definitely will prosecute the individuals that are selling, large amounts of opioids.
So they're going after the
So they're
seller.
going after, the pusher, if you would, I guess.
Okay. So now the Worcester District Attorney's Office has received federal funds, and so has other organizations, to help prevent, educate, and help those who are suffering and those who would be headed for jail through LIFE programs. So what's happening in Massachusetts courts? I know that courts in Fitchburg and Milford were mentioned in an article that I read.
Yeah, so, and I think even here in the city of Worcester, we have diversion programs, right? Some places they call it drug court. And so rather than being, stipulated to jail, to a house of correction or to prison, there is some discrepancy. A judge has some ability to look at a set of facts in conjunction with the district attorney, and they have some programs established that allow folks to sort of divert from going to the house of correction and go to a program that is, educationally based, mental health and behavioral health sort of based. And hopefully folks can get the type of treatment and get the type of care that will help them get into recovery, rather than sending them to a house of correction where the levels of sort of treatment behind the walls are not anywhere near what they would be getting in a more specific, specific sort of treatment facility.
So now there's been news lately, too, of these programs that you hear of, not just for substance abuse, but people getting clothes. Maybe the homeless need clothes, trying to get them jobs. But now there's been people taking those folks that have come out and they really want their life back, but they don't have the funds to do so. So funds are being used from the state, from the government, federal government, by state programs to help some folks get laptops, cell phones, bus passes, learn how to live a life.
Yeah, I think, frankly, that really is once we get people clean, once we get people into recovery, that is, without a doubt, the most important thing that we can do. If we have the opportunity to get people into recovery, but then are unable to sort of show them that they have some hope, then it's really difficult to not backslide and go back into those old behaviors. If you don't have a place to put your head, if you don't have the ability to work, if you don't have the wherewithal, if school is still and education is still important to you to go and continue with your education, then all the treatment in the world, it's a great start. Treatment's a great start. We have to have it to start with. But we absolutely have to have these additional services to bring, hope into their future.
All right. So I want to thank you so much, and I want to end on a quote of yours. This is Representative Jim O'Day from Worcester District, the 14th Worcester District, West Boylston. Thank you for being here, and I hope you allow me to end with this quote. You wrote My Recovery Story in Worcester Medicine, which is put out by the Worcester District Medical Society, and you wrote a very eloquent page about your recovery. And the last two sentence I think is a good way to end the show. And you say, I hope that it reaches at least one person, this story, who sees a glimmer of recognition and begins to consider his or own recovery. I hope that my message is clear. If you're struggling with addiction, give yourself a break and find your way to a recovery community, because recovery works. So thank you very much, Representative O'Day.
It's a good morning. I appreciate it.
I learned a lot. And that's Community Conversations. I'm Vicki Green. Have a wonderful day.